It's a similar moment in the year of 2016. I made a movie with the Blackmagic URSA Mini 4.6. The movie is called Apart, and the director is Mr. Lester Chen. I received a message a few days ago that this movie gained 4 nominations in the Los Angeles AFF America China Film Festival, including Best Actress, Best Production Design, Best Music, and of course, Best Cinematography. Apart was the winning project of the second Hong Kong's first feature films competition. I always say that for an independent production like this, it's better to reserve the best budget for filming but not for equipment. Actually, I don't mind using relatively cheaper equipment, just make sure the equipment can meet my requirements. So I suggest using the Blackmagic URSA Mini 4.6. Why? Since at that moment, only the Panasonic GH4 can externally record a 10-bit 422 signal. Most of the mirrorless cameras can't do that, or for consideration at a cheaper price. The Canon Cinema series are all okay, but I remember that at that moment they can only record ProRes, so I think the Blackmagic is a very attractive option. I remember we are buying brand new product that day, so I couldn't have any testing before. I can only study and compare the specs from different websites. Actually, I have used many different cameras, and I will say that the best must be the Arri Alexa. So I tried to compare the URSA Mini to the Alexa and to see how good can the URSA Mini be. And basically speaking, the URSA Mini has met one of my requirements. Firstly, it can shoot RAW. I've mentioned before in the episode of GH5S. Color and dynamic range are also important in judging the image quality. And regarding the dynamic range, I always think that it is useless to just tell you how well the dynamic range is. The most important is the distribution of the dynamic range. So let's have a look at these 2 charts. The one on the right is the Arri Alexa, while the left one is Blackmagic URSA Mini. You can see that the ISO information is very similar. Both are starting from ISO 160, 200, 400, 1600, 3200. And by the way, not every camera will give you this chart. Regarding the Arri Alexa, its most even distribution is at ISO 800, which gets 7.8 stops up and 6.7 stops down, of which is quite even in the middle, and about 1 more stop in the upper part. Then we look at the Blackmagic. At ISO 800, it gets 7.4 stops up and 6.6 stops down, quite even in the middle as well. But the Blackmagic said that the native ISO should be 400. So let's take a look at the ISO 400. I think it's not as good as ISO 800. Since at ISO 400, it gets only 6.3 stops up and 7.7 stops down. So what does this figure tell you? A lot of times you hear that you should use lower ISO to shoot in order to get cleaner and free of noise image. Well, you can see here, the dynamic range distribution in low ISO is just only 5 or 5.2 stop up at ISO 160, relatively quite low. So how this can affect our images? Well, usually you use low ISO in daylight outdoor or when the lighting situation is good. We take an example by using the face for exposure. The highlight area will be very easily overexposed, and its highlight roll-off is not so pretty as well. It's because there isn't any gradual transition to the peak area. The reason is the dynamic range is just not wide enough in the upper part. Although you know there are 14 stops of dynamic range, if you don't know how the distribution is, it's hard for you to get the best performance. Well, you may ask, if we underexpose a bit in the low ISO and then lift it up in the color grading, maybe we can still get a good result. But the problem here is, without sufficient exposure for a digital sensor, the noise will easily appear in the dark area, and color will not be saturated or accurate enough. So lift up an underexposed image may not be a good idea. Or it may just verify an idea that if the low ISO alone is just so good, we may just shoot with the low ISO. And thus, there's no longer a need to have any high ISO. Of course, that's not the case. You must use the most appropriate ISO to get the most saturated exposure. Then the digital sensor can absorb the most light and achieve the best performance. So this chart is very important, as it can help us to expose and get the best dynamic range. And just by seeing this chart, the performance of Blackmagic is quite close to the RV or lesser. The major defect of this camera is it can be easily get infrared polluted, especially after we add on the ND filters. Although we have placed an anti-infrared filter, when I applied the ND filter heavily, the images were still being affected. And what is the influence? The black area will always get red tinted. Is it a big trouble? Of course, you can correct it in post-production, but it takes you extra efforts. Then talk about my camera B. You may not believe that it's also a Panasonic GH4. Why? Because it can have an external 10-bit 422 signal output. And for this reason, I also bought two video assist recorders, also from Blackmagic, to record the 10-bit 422 signal. And regarding the camera C, it's a Sony A6300. Since I think that the Blackmagic is not a low-light camera, the noise will appear around ISO 1600. I might not get the chance to fully light up all my light scenes, so I hoped there will be a camera with better low light sensitivity. Why don't I choose the A7S? Why? Oh yes, since I didn't have the A7S, I only have a A6300. Because I won't apply any lock color profile to the light scenes, and the 8-bit 422 is barely enough for cine light gamma. And since I have utilized two mirrorless cameras, why do I still use the Blackmagic as my main camera? Because I want to use this set of lenses. This is Sony's SCL-PK6, a set of 6 PL mount lenses. The better cinema lenses are still those PL mount lenses. Of course, EF mount is also available on the URSA Mini, or you add a speed booster to the GH4. Then there are many Canon lenses for your choice. But I still prefer to use those PL mount cinema lenses. What's the point? In fact, the biggest difference between the lenses made for cinema or still photos is, I will say that there are two aspects. First, the body design. For some movie lenses, the focus travel will go to 270 degrees or even 300 degrees. While compared to the lens for still photos, the focus travel is very narrow. It's of course not so good for filming. The second issue is the breathing effect on the lens for still photos, which is when it changes focus, the lens seems to have a zooming effect. It's not a problem for still photos since you are taking photos one by one. But in the case of filming, most people will try to avoid this condition. And if I use the GH4 as my main camera, then I have to apply those Sony lenses directly onto the camera. Since you know that the GH4 is in M4 format, and compared with the full frame, it has a 2x crop factor, or compared to the Super 35 like Blackmagic, of which is equal to the APS-C size. It also gets a 1.5x crop factor. Then the wide-angle lens will become a middle focal length, so I kept the Blackmagic as my main camera. Besides, I forgot to mention, cinema lens sets always get the same size and shape for each lens. For these Sony lenses, except for the 135, the other 5 pieces are all in the same size and shape. When changing the lens, since we will have a follow focus and a matte box, If you have to readjust the position every time, it will be very slow. By using the same set of movie lenses, you can then put back all accessories quickly into the original position, no need to readjust every time. And back to these Sony lenses, their ranges are almost those for general filming. 20, 25, 35, 50, 85 and 135. I think the 20 is not wide enough because generally speaking, the 16 or 18 will be a better wide angle for Super 35. But not all the times you can get the most perfect package, and since our shooting venues are quite big, well, this sacrifice is okay. This set of lenses are all fast lens with an aperture of 2, plus it is T-stop. Same as the camera, I couldn't have a test before buying the lens. I could just study the reviews or comments through different websites. Many reviews position this lens as equivalent to the Coke S4, ARRI Ultra Prime or the Zeiss Compact Prime, but the price is much lower. I remember that it just costs about US 8,000 something for whole set, a very good cost-effective ratio. And for the image quality, many reviews claim that it is in between the Ultra Prime and Compact Prime. Actually, it is very high quality. Somebody may ask, is it better to just buy one wide range zoom or to buy a set of prime lenses? For me, I prefer to buy a set of prime lenses. What's the reason? When you buy a set of prime lenses, just like this set of Sony, you will then have 6 lenses. If you buy a super zoom, you get only one lens. It's convenient at certain moments that shoot with just one super zoom. However, in many productions, we will have multiple cameras. In this case, if you get a set of lenses, take the example of this Sony set again, you may use up to 6 cameras with this lens set, and no need to worry about bringing any other spare lenses.
世間真太多。
山後或者散後呢套戲咧，講嘅咧係一班大學生嘅故事。咁咧就講佢哋喺畢業前咧，就佢哋係一班好朋友，遇上咗雨傘運動，咁佢哋咧就跟好多其他同學咁就係參加啦。咁喺個過程裏邊，即係慢慢發覺咗之間每一個人嗰個期望啊，同埋個性格，甚至到即係每個人真係所想追求嘅嘢係會有唔同咧。但係個故事其實未完，散後啊嘛，咁所以咧係真係講之後，係講緊4年之後，佢哋畢業已經4年啦，咁就重遇翻喎，大家成熟咗啲。經歷咗一啲嘢，咁佢哋嗰個重新再遇翻，佢哋重新塑造翻自己嗰個關係，協取嘅嗰個人生路向啦，每人要行嘅路啦。實際上係講年輕人喺成長同埋喺嗰個愛情路上，一路佢哋點樣去重新尋找自己同埋塑造自己嗰個過程嘅戲。
我大概可以分成3個階段。第一個階段咧就話一個意外地呢個地方爆發咗一個佔領運動嘅時候，咁係一個好特色嘅，好多香港人都會記得，就係成立呢一度嚟呢度，由亞皆老街有個十字路口，一路有20幾架巴士、雙層巴士停晒喺度，係臨時因為突發性嘅走唔到。
Yes, in this first stage, many buses stop on the Lathan Road. For sure, we couldn't film this scenario in a studio.So, we moved to a public road with government approval. We then put 2 buses over there. You may not believe, there were many CG special effects in this movie. Actually, there was a crowd of people who stayed in front of the buses at that time. Of course, we didn't have big budgets to hire many extras for this scene. And by the way, we won't hire thousands of soldiers to shoot a war fight scene in movie making.So, for this scene, we want to show it was a crowd of people. We then locked the camera position, moved the extras several times and shot separately. Then, we add them up as a whole in post-production. My idea of lighting design for light scenes was as much as close to the reality. With an overall ambient of tungsten lights, I then used yellow color key light to simulate those street lamps. It's because we have to match those documentary segments. So I tried the best to keep it similar to the real situation for a perfect matching.
第二個階段咧就係話巴士已經後來清咗啦，洗走咗啦。咁亦都開始咧有一啲人咧覺得曬啊，同埋最緊要10月初嘅時候有個場雨啊，落過雨嚟，開始有啲人咧攞啲帳篷，一啲簡陋啲嘅臨時避雨避太陽嘅一個狀態。第三階段就係話真係有好多已經搭好咗一啲帳篷。亦都有啲細嘅俾人瞓過夜嗰啲小帳篷啊，同埋一啲可能巴士站封咗啲板啊，又寫啲嘢啊咁樣。咁呢個就我第三階段。
I have really thought about filming this third stage by placing the whole set on a roll. It was not a good idea, since we have to block the area for a long time. Or even we can reserve a place for so long, there is still a problem of weather. As a result, we rent a studio. We set a road and place all the tents around. The studio then painted in green color for chroma key purpose.
咁所以咧就分析過之後咧，咁可能就到最後個決定就係話，可能都係用翻我哋叫做實景加廠景啦。咁我哋嘅實景其實都唔少嘅，包括朝早衝出嚟啦，真係拍呢個十字路口啦。我已經做過實地考察嘅，紅燈同紅燈之間咧冇足1分鐘，但係有40幾50秒嘅時間。足夠拍一啲短嘅戲或者幾個鏡頭嘅，然後將唔同嘅鏡頭駁翻埋，其實我哋係做到嘅。有好幾場戲都係咁樣嘅，有實景加我哋廠景係同一場戲裏邊嘅，兩邊 angle 對接咁就 OK 嘅。咁最需要避其實聲都唔緊要，最緊要其實係雙層巴士比較高，同埋當時係佔領期間係呢個台完全冇車噶嘛。咁所以咧就我哋當然有 angle 啦，譬如炒底啊，或者唔同嘅 angle 啊，或者 top down 啊，咁啊避一避個馬路上一啲嘢。咁但係都係日景嘅實景嚟嘅。咁而廠景嘅部分就係話更加重要咧，就係大部分嘅戲可能喺帳篷啊，真係喺馬路中間嘅喎，你點樣偷都冇得偷嘅喎。背後真係有建築物嘅喎，真係有呢啲唔同嘅商鋪，咁嗰個就唯有用廠景啦。咁做一啲嘅 CG 或者我哋 visual effect 做一啲 key 啊、chroma key 啊咁樣。咁所以咧就係透過呢種幾個方式，將馬路嘅戲咧就重現出嚟。咁所以就話透過我哋分析個戲嘅需要，唔同階段嗰個人物背後嘅個環境因素，咁多唔同類型嘅配搭，咁我相信我哋相對喺汕頭呢套戲裏面係成功咁重現咗或者重新建構咗個環境出嚟。
I want to talk about one more point. Why do we have such high requirements for movie cameras? Firstly, in making a movie, it doesn't matter if you can have full control or not. Not all the times you can finish the same scenario in a single shooting time or location. So, you have to match all different sources regarding color and contrast in post-production. If you don't have enough data, this matching would be very difficult. For example, many movies will mix with both studio and real location filming. Here, one of the biggest difference factors is there is true sunlight in a real location, but simulated sunlight in the studio. And finally, you have to mix the footage. So, you must have enough data for matching them, otherwise the result would hardly be good. Here, I try to share with you my experience on mixed using with these 3 cameras. When it's under mixed light, for example, tungsten mixed with fluorescent, GH4 performs not so good, mainly on the aspect of skin tone. The color is not beautiful. But the Blackmagic still performs well under mixed light source. However, when it comes to daylight condition, I think GH4 performs better. The biggest problem with Blackmagic is there's low anti-infrared filter, so that the color is not as accurate and saturated as the GH4. But I know that the Blackmagic has improved its latest camera with internal anti-filters, and I believe the situation has been rectified. Then it comes to the Sony A6300, and actually not much to say. Since I didn't use the A6300 quite a lot, mainly those crane shots or dark light scenes. So there was no big difference compared to the main camera. I want to share with you 2 scenes that I'm quite satisfied with. One was those tents on Living Road were forced to abandon and the road was cleaned up. Our young cast then feel lost. In fact, when deciding the cinematic style of this movie, I don't want it to be 100% realistic. This scene should be in a special mood and emotional change. I want it can be reflected in the color, so I tone it into a metallic grey look, but not too far away from reality. I'm satisfied with the result. The other one was the flashback scene in the classroom. We were having good luck on that shooting day. During the shoot times, the beautiful sunset sunlight was directly coming through the window. The light was so pretty that it really increased the dramatic effect, which was very magical for a flashback scene. For this nomination, if you ask me how is my feeling, I will honestly tell you, I'm happy. Since I don't need an ARIA lesson to get me a nomination, I think the Blackmagic can do that, or many mirrorless cameras can do that also. Of course, I hoped finally I can win that award. As I always say, equipment is important but not the most important, and in the end, it's not a very expensive or high-spec camera, but rather it's the people behind the scene that make the difference and achieve the best result.